La vie peut être une aventure passionnée et rapide,
Lente ou triste.
et parfois remplie de hauts et de bas.
Mais d'après les psychiatres, on peut mettre l'étiquette maladie mentale sur tout aspect de la vie.
Vraiment? Comme quoi?
Si vous avez le cœur lourd après une grosse dispute, l'étiquette pourrait dire dépression,
Si vous êtes nerveux avant de parler en public,
trouble de l'anxiété,
ou bien bavard et plein d'entrain,
maniaque.
ça semble un peu dingue.
Ça l'est.
Mais ça se passe vraiment?
Allons demander.
How many people do you know that have been diagnosed with a mental disorder?
Diagnosed with a mental, God, off the top of my head, maybe one person that I know who's been diagnosed with a mental disorder.
Probably just one.
So, yeah, maybe 2 or 3 people, maybe in the 3 or 4 range.
4 or 5, maybe 5.
6 people in the household.
6, 7.
10.
A dozen or so.
About 20.
How about 30?
Would definitely be in the hundreds for sure.
The total number of people that I know in my lifetime has been diagnosed with a mental disorder probably fall around the range of 100 to 150, and I'm 23 years old.
Ça alors? Mais d'où viennent tous ces troubles?
Du manuel diagnostique et statistique des troubles mentaux. Il fait 943 pages et traite de tout. Dépression, anxiété, bégaiement, dépendance à la cigarette, peur des araignées, cauchemars, difficultés en maths et même troubles de l'enfance. Tous réinterprétés et faussement présentés comme des maladies du cerveau.
Mais il y a des gens qui ont de graves problèmes dans la vie.
Bien sûr. Mais pour les psychiatres, c'est juste votre cerveau qui a quelque chose qui ne va pas.
Alors si je comprends bien, les psychiatres ont un livre des problèmes de la vie réinterprétés comme des troubles mentaux?
Effectivement,
Eh bien, cela doit avoir une base très scientifique.
ça le devrait, mais ce n'est pas le cas. Les psychiatres l'ont même admis à une de leurs conventions récentes. Écoute-les.
DSM is made up by committees of men who have political opinion, and women too, who have biases and political opinions. And so there isn't nearly as much science in DSM as there ought to be.
Like in the previous one, people had a meeting in the bathroom and they decided that something should be in there, and then they would go and propose it to the whole committee.
You have this kind of lumping together of several observations, and when you get enough of them in one tent, you got a diagnosis.
DSM system is not the real system of the diagnosis.
A lot of the disorders that are in there haven't necessarily been rigorously validated.
It's just the best tool that we have available, but it is not perfect.
It's so useless that if you give me a patient and the DSM, I'll make at least 20 diagnoses on the same patient.
You have to take it with a grain of salt anyway. It's actually getting more and more complicated.
We're left with diagnosing things on the basis of checklists and questionnaires, which leaves us sort of out of, as you said, the rest of medicine because we don't have a biological test.
Incroyable.
La base non scientifique du DSM est en effet un secret de polichinelle. Voilà ce que des professionnels en disent.
The DSM is a sham. It's been described as a house of cards. Why? Because the diagnoses are theoretical. They're not based on scientific measurements.
It's sort of a shaky level built on another shaky level, built on another shaky level.
It is flimsy and that it is easily collapsible under the scrutiny of critical thinking.
If you just pull one little fragment of the reasoning aside and questioning thoroughly, you'll find it doesn't stand up, and then that means that the whole organism collapses because you've got some wrong premises in there somewhere. In fact, they're all over the place.
It is indeed a house of cards because it's predicated on not a solid structure. It is built to create an apparently legitimate edifice, which results in a diagnosis. But any serious inquiry will show it to be illegitimate.
Here, I tell you. With schizophrenia,
Si le DSM n'a pas de base scientifique, d'où vient-il?
Il est né du simple désir pour la psychiatrie et la psychologie d'être accepté au sein de la médecine traditionnelle.
We psychologists have always desperately wanted to be accepted as a real science, as a true science. Now, what the early psychologists did was they looked around and they saw what other scientists were doing and they decided to emulate them.
Modern approaches to classifying psychiatric disorders dates from the 19th century.
Nearly all the clinical concepts we have today originate from that time. Probably the most important of all was a chap called Emil Kraepelin, who worked first of all in Heidelberg and then in Munich.
Jamais entendu parler.
Émile Kraepelin est le père de la classification psychiatrique. Il fut le premier à classer ce qu'il pensait être des maladies biologiques du cerveau. Il y avait la démence précoce, ou schizophrénie, la maladie maniaco-dépressive et la psychose paranoïaque. Tous des concepts qui sont encore dans le DSM.
C'est tout? 3 troubles.
Oui, seulement 3. Mais le système de Kraepelin est vite devenu très populaire. Écoute ça.
Kraepelin's system caught on very quickly, not only in the German-speaking world, but also in the English-speaking world, in the United States and Britain. It caught on because up to that point, nobody had an agreed way of talking about patients.
So in the early 1950s, there was compiled Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, there are very few statistics in the book. Disorder is used essentially as a euphemism for illness. This is a book which catalogues mental illnesses for which no medical sign has ever been discovered.
Le livret original faisait 130 pages et comptait 112 troubles mentaux, bien moins que le DSM actuel, mais bien plus que ce que Kraepelin avait entrevu.
Pourquoi autant?
Parce que, en définissant de plus en plus d'aspects de la vie comme anormaux, les psychiatres pouvaient obtenir des sommes folles du gouvernement.
En définissant la vie, ça veut dire quoi?
Eh bien, retenir sa respiration, se ronger les ongles, sucer son pouce, être somnambule, manquer d'efficacité, même l'homosexualité.
C'est ridicule. Ils ont rajouté tout ça pour avoir des gens à soigner?
Et même plus. La deuxième version, le DSM-II, fut publiée en 1968 avec 178 troubles. Là encore, pour soutirer encore plus d'argent aux caisses de sécurité sociale. Pour avoir une portée internationale, le DSM-II fut aligné sur la classification internationale des maladies, la CIM. Un livre très utilisé en Europe et dans le monde, qui, en plus des diagnostics psychiatriques, énumère aussi les vraies maladies.
C'est comme ça que les troubles psychiatriques ont été acceptés par la médecine courante?
C'était le début. Mais le DSM-II n'était toujours pas scientifique, car il était fortement influencé non pas par des tests cliniques, mais par les théories du psychologue autrichien Sigmund Freud.
Alors il devait y avoir beaucoup de névroses dans ce livre?
Ouais, mais pas la moindre information sur leur cause. Ils n'en ont même pas cherché la cause.
Inclusion of a disorder in the classification does not require that there be knowledge about its etiology. So in other words, to make a diagnosis, you really don't need to bother with cause and effect. You don't need to know what causes the condition.
Mais attends, si le DSM ne donne pas la cause des troubles, comment font les psychiatres pour même les découvrir?
La réponse pourrait te surprendre.
New diseases are being invented all the time, and I want to emphasize the word invented, because when it comes to psychiatry, mental illnesses are not discovered, they're invented.
The way the system works in terms of diagnosis is that every few years a group of psychiatrists and psychologists sit around in a room and vote on new diagnoses.
Et c'est de la science? Je ne peux pas y croire.
T'en fais pas, t'es pas le seul.
The diseases are voted on? What do you mean?
Did you say, are they voted into existence?
Are voted?
As in created.
Oh, man.
I think that's kind of ridiculous.
It's crazy that you would vote. I definitely don't agree.
I don't agree with it at all.
Mental disorders should be based on scientific research.
I have been led to believe that it's all based on medicine and science.
So I'm kind of shocked to find that out.
Moi aussi.
Ce n'est pas tout. Non seulement les troubles mentaux sont inclus par vote, mais parfois ils sont aussi exclus par vote. Prenons par exemple l'homosexualité, qui figurait dans le DSM-I et II comme une maladie mentale. Voici comment l'éditeur en chef du DSM-III, Robert Spitzer, explique la chose.
I came up with a definition in 1973 that made it possible to argue that homosexuality was not a mental disorder.
On a vote, essentially, at a conference of the American Psychiatric Association, it was removed.
Now, did they discover that homosexuality was not a disease through scientific processes? No. It was included for political reasons, and it was removed for political reasons.
And the end result is a vote. It's a supposed democracy. So to call it science is is a complete fabrication.
Donc le DSM est en fait politique, pas scientifique.
Absolument.
Je croyais que les psychiatres voulaient être considérés comme étant des docteurs.
C'est vrai. C'est pour cela que leur manuel devait avoir l'air plus scientifique.
Mais ils ne l'étaient pas. Qu'ont-ils fait alors?
Eh bien, ils ont décidé que la prochaine édition serait complètement différente. Cette décision allait changer la psychiatrie à jamais.
If you roll the clock forward to the 1970s in the United States, basically at that time psychiatry was in very poor shape for a number of reasons. First of all, it was held in very low regard by other members of the medical profession. So psychiatry was the sort of thing you did if you couldn't succeed in any other area of medicine.
And people such as Robert Spitzer in America made it very clear that the time had come essentially for psychiatrists, being doctors of medicine, to practice medicine. So if a psychiatrist was spending a lot of time dealing with people who were anxious, depressed, these dilemmas, these problems in living, now essentially had to be redefined. And they were redefined as medical conditions.
And their solution to this was to come up with a manual which defined psychiatric disorders more carefully. So, hence, we have DSM-III, which is the third edition, which is published in 1980.
Sous Spitzer, les éditeurs du DSM-III ont éliminé la psychologie freudienne et ont décrété que les diagnostics psychiatriques seraient désormais purement biologiques.
Alors ils sont finalement devenus scientifiques?
Non, en fait pas du tout. D'ailleurs, les querelles politiques concernant quels troubles seraient inclus ou omis du DSM-III furent encore plus ridicules. Voici comment un psychiatre le décrit.
They would squeeze into a room which was about half the size of this one. It was much too small. And Bob would raise a provocative question, and people would shout out their opinions from all sides of the room. And whoever shouted loudest tended to be heard. My own impression is it was more like a tobacco auction than a sort of conference.
Et voici ce qu'a dit un autre membre de ce comité.
The low level of intellectual effort was shocking. Diagnoses were developed by majority vote on the level we would use to choose a restaurant. You feel like Italian, I feel like Chinese, so let's go to a cafeteria. Then it's typed into the computer. It may reflect on our naivete, but it was our belief that there would be an attempt to look at things scientifically.
Donc leur manuel diagnostique avait l'air plus scientifique, sans offrir plus de science qu'avant.
Et le nombre de troubles mentaux dans le DSM-III a grimpé à 259. Mais pour faire accepter l'idée que la psychiatrie était bien une science médicale, il leur fallait une théorie qui ait l'air très scientifique.
But with DSM-III from 1980 on, there was the progressive medicalisation of psychiatry, and the notion of chemical imbalance was invented and essentially took hold.
Hein? Quel déséquilibre?
La théorie du déséquilibre chimique. Née en 1965, elle tentait d'expliquer que la dépression pourrait résulter d'un déséquilibre parmi certaines substances chimiques cérébrales.
Vas-y, raconte.
Selon Joseph Schildkraut, si les psychotropes changent le niveau de ces substances chimiques, alors la maladie mentale doit être causée par des niveaux trop élevés ou trop faibles de ces substances.
N'est-ce pas à l'envers?
Si, pour sûr. Autant dire que si l'aspirine arrête un mal de tête, ça veut dire que les maux de tête sont causés par un manque d'aspirine.
Je vois ce que tu veux dire.
Mais c'était suffisamment convaincant pour donner à la psychiatrie et au DSM-III un air de science. Comme l'a dit Robert Spitzer,
Psychiatry felt now, gee, we're more scientific, we're part of medicine.
Donc ça a marché.
Oui. Et depuis, les psychiatres et l'industrie pharmaceutique n'ont cessé de promouvoir cette théorie de déséquilibre chimique auprès des médecins et du public.
If you're one of the millions of people who live with uncontrollable worry, anxiety, and several of these symptoms for 6 months or more, you could be suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, and a chemical imbalance could be to blame.
Pristique is thought to work by affecting the levels of two chemicals in the brain.
It works to correct chemical imbalances in the brain, which may be related to symptoms of social anxiety disorder.
Cymbalta works on serotonin,
and norepinephrine.
Hundreds of thousands of patients have been prescribed Abilify. Ask your doctor.
Ask your doctor.
Talk to your doctor. Call your doctor.
Ask your doctor about Cymbalta.
Prestique is a key in helping to treat my depression. Ask your doctor about Prestique.
You come to my office, and I say to you, well, you describe what's going on in your life and your symptoms, and I say, well, it's clear to me that you've got a chemical imbalance, and we're going to write you a prescription for this. The truth of the matter is, there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance.
There's no test out there that they can depend on that tells you you have a chemical imbalance.
There's actually, in fact, dozens of studies showing that there isn't any measurable imbalance. So psychiatrists will explain to patients all the time, this is just like diabetes. In diabetes, you have low insulin, we have to readjust the insulin level. In depression, you have low serotonin, we have to readjust the serotonin level. But actually, we have already proven that there's nothing wrong with serotonin levels. It's completely a myth, disproven by our own evidence.
I had a psychiatrist. He said that, in his professional opinion, this child had ADHD, a chemical imbalance of the brain. And when he was questioned on the witness stand as an expert witness for the state, he was asked if they had done an MRI. He said no. He was questioned if they had done a CAT scan. He said no. He was asked if they had done any bodily fluid check known to medical science to prove that this child had a chemical imbalance of the brain. He says no. And when he was asked how he arrived at this ADHD diagnosis, a chemical imbalance of the brain, it came down to that he had counseled and observed this child for 2 hours, and half of the time was observing. How do you arrive at a diagnosis of a chemical imbalance of the brain by talking to a child and observing them for 2 hours? You don't, okay? It's pure guesswork.
Wow, est-ce vraiment possible?
Vois pour toi-même. Voici une personne qui est allée voir plusieurs psychiatres avec une caméra cachée et a demandé un test pour maladie mentale.
Of any scientific test?
Not that I'm prepared to do this time.
So you getting that I have adjustment, what is it?
Adjustment disorder with mixed emotional features. It just means situational stress.
Right,
it's a formal diagnosis.
But I'm saying, just where do you get that from?
I take you at face value.
In terms of diagnosis, there's no way that I can x-ray or project or
So it's very hard to have an effective measure. Because whatever's going wrong is happening in there, and we just can't go in and open up somebody's skull and scoop something out to measure.
Right now, we don't have an x-ray or a blood test. That doesn't mean that the diagnosis is not clear.
The diagnosis is for insurance, and I'm not really trying to think too much in terms of diagnosis. I don't really see that as my main job here to make a diagnosis, except to give something to the insurance that's reasonably accurate.
But we don't even really know what's going wrong in the brain. So all the things that we found were found by accident.
Je suis sidéré. Le diagnostic psychiatrique est basé purement sur l'opinion individuelle.
Quoi qu'il fasse, il se trompe. La BBC a même fait une émission où 10 volontaires, 5 considérés comme normaux et 5 déjà diagnostiqués comme mentalement malades, furent observés par 3 fameux experts en santé mentale et ils ont dû dire qui était qui.
Oh là là.
Regarde ça.
We think that it's likely that you've had a history of bipolar disorder. Is that correct?
You're wrong.
Okay.
We've come to the conclusion that at some time you've been diagnosed with a mood disorder.
You're wrong.
We were wondering whether at some point in your life maybe that you had suffered from a significant psychiatric problem of some kind or other.
No.
Not at all?
You are wrong.
All right, okay.
3 wrong diagnoses in a row. After a whole week of observation, the panel have identified just 2 out of 5 disorders.
Tu parles d'une science.
Ça, c'est sûr.
Okay, time in.
Love it.
And
I got a pair of compulsive disorders here.
J'ai une question. Comment les psychiatres peuvent-ils parler de faits démontrés quand ils n'ont rien prouvé?
C'est pire que ça. Non seulement les psychiatres n'ont pas de test pour prouver les étiquettes qu'ils vous collent, ils ne peuvent pas définir ce qu'est un trouble mental.
Non.
C'est même écrit dans le DSM, regarde ça.
Although this manual provides a classification of mental disorders, it must be admitted that no definition adequately specifies precise boundaries for the concept of mental disorder. There you go.
Incroyable.
Mais les psychiatres n'avaient pas encore fini. 14 ans après le DSM-III, ils ont publié le DSM-IV et son rédacteur en chef fut encore plus direct en ce qui concerne le terme trouble mental.
There is no definition of a mental disorder. It's bullshit. I mean, you just can't define it.
Donc, tout en admettant qu'ils ne pouvaient pas définir ce qu'était un trouble mental, terme qui est dans le titre de leur propre manuel, ils en ont rajouté encore d'autres.
Beaucoup d'autres. 115 pour être précise, ce qui fait 374 au total.
C'est 3 fois plus le nombre de troubles donnés dans le DSM-I.
En à peine plus de 40 ans. Et le livre pèse plus de 2 kilos.
C'est plus gros que l'annuaire téléphonique d'une grande ville.
C'est un catalogue de maladies mentales. Et il a servi à faire le diagnostic de 120 millions de personnes dans le monde.
Ça alors. Mais qu'en est-il de la classification internationale des maladies? Y a-t-il eu un accroissement des troubles mentaux là aussi?
Absolument. La section des troubles mentaux et du comportement de la CIM est pratiquement parallèle au DSM. Les changements dans le DSM sont reflétés dans la CIM.
D'accord. Bon, jusque-là, j'ai appris qu'il n'y a pas de test pour identifier ou confirmer le diagnostic d'un trouble mental, que la théorie du déséquilibre chimique est sans fondement et que les psys ne savent pas ce qu'est un trouble mental.
Et ils l'admettent, du moins entre eux. Voici un extrait d'une récente convention de l'Association psychiatrique américaine.
You're sitting in your office, you see a depressed patient, you have no idea what's the matter with them. And I know all of you think you know the answer, but in terms of evidence, I don't know the answer and I don't think any of us really know.
C'est stupéfiant.
Et pourtant, ils sont très prompts à vous donner un diagnostic. Voici un autre psychiatre influent à la même conférence.
Jim Burley at the Maudsley Hospital did a study once on how long it took people to make up their mind about the diagnosis after they entered a room. And it was about, how many, David? It was 2 seconds? It was a couple of minutes. It was very...
Dans les 2 minutes?
Ouais. Même le président de l'Association psychiatrique américaine a dit que le DSM était plus ou moins une blague.
Well, what does D stand for? I used to think it is diagnostic, but over the last few years realized it is more like a dartboard.
Jeu de fléchettes? Est-ce que les psychiatres disent ça à leurs patients?
Non. Ils se comportent comme s'ils savaient de quoi ils parlent, tout en tenant le public dans l'ignorance.
I was sent to a psychiatrist who saw me again for maybe about 15 minutes, talked to me how I was doing at 7 years old, and I left with a prescription for Ritalin.
Probably within the first 15 minutes, he diagnosed me with having an anxiety disorder and put me on prescription medication.
The amount of time it took for the diagnosis was, I'd say, probably within 10 minutes I was diagnosed with anxiety, with depression, within 10 minutes of speaking to the psychiatrist, and I was put on those drugs immediately.
I received numerous different diagnoses from different doctors, and each one gave me a different drug.
I didn't have to undergo any tests. I didn't even have to sit there and I didn't have to ask any questions. It was just, that's what you've got, and this is the drug.
They really didn't talk to me. They were always talking and questioning my mother. It was all about getting the information from her and not from me.
It doesn't make sense to me. I researched it, I done my research, and I still can't fully understand how you can diagnose somebody with a short attention span.
There was never an explanation. Nobody really knew what it was or why it was caused or how did you get it, why did anybody have it, and what could anybody do about it? Just here, have some medicine and go away.
And I was put on, a horse's dose of an antidepressant called Effexor, 450 milligrams a day. They say if you're on 300, you're comatose.
It wasn't always Ritalin. It went from Ritalin to Wellbutrin to Concerta
to Adderall. I remember asking these doctors, is there any other way we can do this? Is there any other therapy? Is there something we can do that won't make me feel so badly, that won't give me all these side effects and just horrible sensations through my body 24 hours a day? Is there something else I can do that might be not having to do with medications? Doctor said, no. See, what you have is very complex. You have a chemical imbalance in your brain that the only thing that can correct it is medication.
Allons bon, ça fait beaucoup de diagnostics, mais ils ne sont suivis que de médicaments.
En effet, de nos jours, un diagnostic psychiatrique implique une drogue psychiatrique.
The whole question then becomes, okay, if we apply these labels, what next? And the what next tends to be, you get a prescription. And the prescription is for a drug that doesn't work very well and is toxic.
It's like a 1-2 punch. The number one of the 1-2 punch is the diagnostic manual. You've got all these disorders to choose from. The two is the treatment. So you've got the diagnostic manual in place, you've got a machinery in place, and then you've got this treatment that is there for the taking.
For everything you can think of that might seem to be odd behavior, the psychiatry field has a name for it. And then for every name of every diagnosis you have, there's going to be pharmacology behind it, and they have a pill for it.
Let me fan it out and pick a card, and there you go. Here's your label, and there's the drug that we'll give you to go along with that label.
98%, maybe 99% of people will get a diagnosis that justifies the use of a medication and also a follow-up appointment. Because remember, the business of medicine, the business of psychiatry, is seeing patients. And the psychiatrist that tells a patient they don't have a problem and there's no medicine for that problem doesn't have a very busy practice.
And that's sort of the purpose of the DSM-345, to provide a diagnosis that can be given a drug for that patient.
It's a quick buck. You don't need to do a physical exam. You put it in the chart, it's done. Prescribe away. Lifetime patient. That's what the DSM is for.
Sont-ils en train de dire que le DSM n'existe que pour justifier la médication?
Je crains que oui.
Oh, dis donc. Si le traitement principal de la psychiatrie est la médication, il doit s'en faire beaucoup des prescriptions.
Absolument. Savais-tu qu'on écrit plus de 600 millions d'ordonnances pour des médicaments psychiatriques chaque année?
Oh là là! Mais qu'advient-il des patients qui ne veulent pas de drogue?
Le DSM a aussi une catégorie pour cela, qu'est-ce que tu crois?
It says V15.81, non-compliance with treatment. Now this category can be used when the focus of clinical attention is non-compliance with an important aspect of treatment for a mental disorder or a general medical condition. If you refuse treatment, then you probably are mentally ill, ipso facto, by that fact alone.
Donc, si on ne fait pas ce que dit le psychiatre, c'est un trouble mental.
Tout à fait.
Ça fait carrément peur. Mais pourquoi ne pas suivre le traitement?
Parce que les médicaments que les psychiatres prescrivent peuvent provoquer des réactions physiques graves et très intenses.
Tu veux dire des effets secondaires?
Eh bien, pas exactement.
Drugs really don't have side effects. Drugs only have effects, and we arbitrarily differentiate those effects of the drug that we like, and we say these are the effects of the drug. And those that we don't like, those are the side effects. It's akin to saying that a bomb that comes down on a building kills people and destroys the building, and the military general says, oh, killing of the people is really a side effect. No, you cannot separate out the destroying of the building and the killing of the people. And so these are not side effects, these are direct effects of the drug creating disaster.
People think antidepressants are going to make them happy, but it's not what they do. They numb them down, and then in themselves there's a withdrawal state from the antidepressants.
They just become like robots, some of them. They're not actually able to experience the whole variety and range of human feelings and emotions and work with them and express with them and share them with others. Because once you sort of put somebody on a heavy dose psychotic drug, I mean, you're just dehumanizing them.
These are very potent, very toxic medicines, cause on themselves diabetes, high cholesterol, cause what's called a metabolic syndrome, truncal obesity, premature hardening of the arteries.
They affect the heart and the lungs and the kidneys, and you never know exactly what to expect.
Most psychotropic drugs lead to massive weight gain. Some of them, like olanzapine, for example, can lead to weight gains of 25, 30, even 40 kilos in a year or two, and that is serious.
One of the side effects is it affects your sexual performance abilities.
In people who are on a lot of medication, they're just totally unable to detoxify through their liver, and then other functions of the body shut down one by one.
These drugs have on their labels may increase risk of suicide and homicide in people who take them, just like a carton of cigarettes has to say may be hazardous to your health.
And there's cases where many people who commit suicide or commit acts of violence are on these medications, which definitely has this type of side effect.
You look at the side effect profile is identical to what they're trying to treat, and in some cases worse, and especially in the instance of suicide, then you can see that it's an extremely treacherous area with very, very little actual science behind it.
C'est une blague. Ce sont des drogues dangereuses.
C'est sûr. Et des milliers, si ce n'est des millions de gens, ont cherché l'aide d'un psychiatre et ont reçu des drogues qui ont fini par les détruire. Des gens comme Candice, mise sous Zoloft parce qu'elle avait le trac avant des examens. Steven s'est suicidé 19 jours après être mis sous Prozac. Julie voulait aller à l'université, mais s'est pendue après 7 jours de prise de Zoloft. Matthew s'est pendu à l'âge de 13 ans. Matt prenait un cocktail de psychotropes à 21 ans. Kathleen, sous Zoloft et Trazodone. Beth prenait du Paxil pour de l'insomnie. Matt, sous Lexapro. Charles, sous Clozaril. Kathleen, en 6e. Megan, Aaron.
Attends une minute. C'est de la folie. Tu dis bien que tous ces gens qui se sont tués prenaient des médicaments psychiatriques?
Ouais. Le nombre de morts par an liés à des drogues psychiatriques est estimé à 42 000, que ce soit par homicide ou suicide.
C'est plus de 3000 personnes par mois. Il faut retirer ces drogues du marché.
Absolument. Mais comme ces drogues constituent le seul traitement que les psychiatres ont à offrir, ils minimisent les risques. Et ce sont leurs patients qui en subissent les conséquences.
When you get on psychiatric drugs, you feel just like you don't really want to live anymore. Like, just depressed all the time, and you feel sad.
You don't feel like you're in your own skin. It almost feels like you just want to come out of your skin all the time.
Get really bad headaches, I'd start shaking. I wouldn't sleep very well, I'd have nightmares.
I had started shaking really bad, and it was like uncontrollable, you know? And it's like, I don't understand why I shake so much.
It brought on the symptoms that I was trying to escape from, very severe.
I'd go through spells where I'd just be completely just dead. There would not be me there. I'd just be standing there and there would be nothing.
I think we all have emotions, happy, sad, you know, situational emotions in life, and it didn't allow me to experience them.
You don't experience tears, you don't experience a lot of laughter. It just makes life real flatline.
I described to a friend of mine as like waking up in a manila folder and it's a cloudy day. Everything is boring, unmemorable, unspecial.
It changed me. It changed who I was. It changed the essence of my personality.
You know, it just started making me worse. And I got in such bad fights with my brother. I scratched his face up and, you know, stuff like that.
I started to experience suicidal ideations almost immediately. And I had never had any feeling like that before.
I remember when I was at home one day, I had taken my medication and I thought about killing myself, and I got really scared, so I ran to my brother and I told him, and he just held me and told me not to give up and to just keep trying.
And I actually thought that's maybe the one thing that I do have control over, that I could, you know, I could off myself, and I would be out of this roller coaster of an existence.
I have been raped. I have been coerced into doing things that I do not care to speak of. But just to put it in perspective, even having experienced that, the experiences in thoughts and loss of self that I had, being put on Prozac was the worst violation I have ever experienced.
Je ne sais plus quoi dire. Les gens n'ont aucune idée de ce que font ces drogues parce qu'ils font confiance à leur psychiatre.
Non seulement ça, mais des études récentes ont montré que les drogues telles que les antidépresseurs ne sont pas plus efficaces qu'un cachet neutre, un placebo.
Donc en résumé, non seulement le DSM fournit l'étiquette que le psychiatre vous donne, mais il justifie la prescription de drogues puissantes mais inefficaces qui ont de nombreux effets secondaires. C'est vraiment affreux.
Absolument. Et pourtant, les psychiatres s'accrochent à l'idée qu'ils peuvent corriger un comportement indésirable avec de la chimie. Bien sûr, la psychiatrie est d'un grand intérêt pour l'industrie pharmaceutique, laquelle peut vendre des psychotropes pour chaque trouble contenu dans le DSM.
J'ai vu leur campagne de marketing, c'est partout.
Oui, mais si tu remarques bien, ils font aussi le marketing des troubles mentaux. Les laboratoires pharmaceutiques font de la publicité pour les troubles du DSM dans la presse, à la télévision et sur Internet, conseillant vivement aux gens de parler à leur docteur. Leurs experts payés parlent de nouvelles épidémies de maladies mentales dans des talk-shows. Ils placent des articles dans les journaux et recrutent des psychiatres pour conduire des études et écrire des papiers qui donnent une apparence scientifique aux troubles mentaux.
Parce que si les gens pensent qu'ils ont le trouble, ils demanderont le psychotrope.
Exactement.
The pharmaceutical industry markets disorders. Because if you can market a disorder, then you've got something to sell your product to treat.
So people suddenly come to think of things they previously didn't regard as a disease state as a disease, go to the doctor, see the psychiatrist then prescribes the drug that the drug companies have received FDA approval for, and everyone is happy except for the patient.
They're all working together, the psychiatrists, the pharmaceuticals, and one feeds the other. So again, job security for the pharmaceuticals and also job security for the psychiatrists.
Il n'y a pas que les laboratoires pharmaceutiques qui font la campagne pour ces maladies. Un psychiatre, Joseph Biederman, a créé et popularisé un trouble appelé bipolaire pédiatrique. Il a déclaré que ce trouble pouvait commencer dès que l'enfant ouvre les yeux.
Bipolaire? Comme saute d'humeur pour les enfants?
Malheureusement, oui. En 9 ans, Dr Biederman a alimenté à lui seul une explosion du nombre d'enfants étiquetés comme étant bipolaires. Et la plupart furent mis sous des antipsychotiques puissants, conçus pour les maladies mentales les plus graves.
Je ne savais pas.
Même le psychiatre qui a rédigé le DSM-IV a admis que celui-ci a contribué à lancer la mode du bipolaire pour enfants.
Well, we learned some very, very painful lessons in doing DSM-IV, but inadvertently, I think we helped to trigger 3 false epidemics. One for the childhood diagnosis of bipolar disorder.
Trop tard maintenant, n'est-ce pas?
Pour beaucoup d'enfants, oui. Vu que les psychiatres prétendent que les troubles mentaux tels que bipolaires ne se guérissent pas, ils se sont fait des clients à vie pour eux et l'industrie pharmaceutique.
Donc c'est un partenariat naturel?
Absolument. L'industrie pharmaceutique fournit aux psychiatres des sommes énormes pour la recherche et ceux-ci inventent encore plus de maladies à traiter avec des psychotropes.
Drug companies have become increasingly dependent on mental illness diagnoses in order to maintain their profit margins. And psychiatrists and increasingly clinical psychologists are more than happy to manufacture mental illness in order to make that happen. Hence, the increase in size of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
The strategy is how many people we can diagnose with a particular label that would be broad enough to include a ton of people in it. And the mentality behind that is the sale of the pharmaceutical drug, which eventually becomes the treatment.
These drug companies are making a lot of money, and they're spilling that money and sending that money to people that will help support their cause. So it's not a surprise at all that they have infiltrated so many of the committees within the DSM and so much of our own medical education.
Attends. L'industrie pharmaceutique a infiltré les comités de psychiatres qui décident quels troubles ajouter dans le prochain DSM?
Dans le DSM-IV, 56% des membres du comité avaient des liens financiers personnels avec l'industrie pharmaceutique. L'industrie qui allait profiter des 115 maladies mentales supplémentaires qui ont été votées.
Et bien sûr, on a de plus en plus de maladies qui seront traitées avec les drogues.
Et encore plus de symptômes pour chacune.
The whole world is being made crazy, really. And we have these proliferation of categories which have become more and more encompassing, encroaching in ordinary everyday life.
There isn't a human being on the planet who doesn't have at some point, if not several points, in a day or a week, distress. It's part of being human. But to say that because you have this distress, that you now are diseased?
If you take a god man in India who wanders around with a shawl and meditates for 17 hours a day, drinks rainwater and engages in some kind of spiritual or religious discipline or practice where he might roll on the ground for 100 miles to a holy place, people there don't persecute those individuals. They accept them as people engaged in religious practices. But here, if you took those same individuals in India and you had them walk across a campus in America, they would immediately be arrested and put into a psychiatric facility because they're manifesting psychosis. This varies by culture.
What do we want to straitjacket everybody? Is everyone going to be the same? What about people that do have a little bit odd behavior? Is a little odd behavior bad or dangerous? It's just different.
You want this thing to cover, all manner of aberrant human behavior. So if you can cover every bit of it, then you're going to have the best chance possible to a billable unit of service.
Et d'ailleurs, si aucune de leurs catégories ne convient pour vous, il y en a une autre dans laquelle ils peuvent vous caser.
Naturellement.
This is number 301.9.
312.9. 292.9.
Bipolar disorder, not otherwise specified.
Gender identity disorder, not otherwise specified.
Disorder of infancy, childhood, or adolescence, not otherwise specified.
Not otherwise specified. What the hell does that say? They don't know.
It's kind of like a catch-all.
It's the garbage can for the leftovers.
There's even a box for people that don't fit in the other boxes.
To me, it's insane.
This is like rubbish to me.
This is scary to me.
This is hackery, quackery, dockery.
Qu'il faille créer une catégorie divers pour ce qui reste démontre la médiocrité de cette science.
Tout à fait. Comme le trouble de l'attention et hyperactivité sans précision, trouble de l'alimentation sans précision, trouble de l'humeur sans précision.
You can always use the NOS, the not otherwise specified diagnosis, and that's a billable service.
Not otherwise specified means that you're sort of at sea to some extent on the exact diagnosis, meaning it doesn't fit into any of the categories you've established.
Unspecified mental disorder. You see, that's considered a disorder. Having nothing wrong with you is now a disorder. That's what this says. Can you believe it?
Non, je ne peux pas y croire. Il y a une catégorie trouble mental sans autre indication? Autant dire, et on va pas vous la décrire. C'est une maladie mentale aussi?
Pire encore, selon le DSM, vous pourriez avoir comme diagnostic une maladie mentale non listée.
Sans blague.
Tiens, écoute ça.
These diagnostic criteria and the DSM-IV classification of mental disorders reflect a consensus of current formulations of evolving knowledge in our field. They do not encompass, however, all the conditions for which people may be treated or that may be appropriate topics for research efforts.
It's even in the language of the introduction, it's basically saying we're trying to have a diagnosis to cover all the bases of anything that somebody could come in complaining about, which is, again, entirely backwards from how medical diagnoses are come to.
Ce DSM n'a rien à voir avec la médecine.
Non, c'est du marketing pur et simple.
God bless the insurance company. You get these multiple personalities, you can call insurance companies.
Insurance billing, that's the big money right there.
Il y a encore quelque chose qui me chiffonne. Si le traitement psychiatrique est si long, si cher et inefficace.
Je sais. Qui serait disposé à dépenser des sommes énormes pour des traitements psychiatriques qui durent des années, souvent toute une vie, et donnent des résultats si minables?
Exactement. Qui paie pour tout ça?
Essentiellement les caisses d'assurance gouvernementales et privées.
Les assurances?
D'ailleurs, les groupes de pression psychopharma excellent à faire passer des lois pour forcer les assurances à couvrir les soins de santé mentale de la même façon que les soins médicaux réguliers.
C'est l'égalité de la santé mentale, n'est-ce pas?
Exactement. Mais sur le plan économique, c'est une catastrophe.
So there's nobody who walks into a psychiatrist's office that isn't going to go out with a label. He's got 374 choices or so based on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual list of symptoms. So he's got to fit you into one of those categories in order to get paid.
The DSM really should be called, how to bill the insurance companies, how to get money from the insurance companies. It's a list of codes, and there's a number for everything, and that number goes on an insurance form, and then you get payment for it.
The DSM is completely built into the system now because you can't get reimbursed by an insurance company unless there's a DSM diagnosis.
You know, a kid wets the bed, you can bill on that. They're going to have one called a skin picking disorder. You pick your skin, you can diagnose and bill on that. You know, you can always find a diagnosis and you'll always be able to bill.
A psychiatrist or a psychologist can go through their book now and find a diagnosis code for just about anything. Everybody would fall into something that they could put a diagnosis on and fraud insurance companies.
Quelle arnaque!
Absolument. Chaque année, l'industrie psychiatrique se sert du DSM pour amasser 100 milliards de dollars des assurances privées ou gouvernementales américaines. Et cela dans un seul pays.
Je commence à me rendre compte à quel point le DSM a élevé le coût total des traitements médicaux.
Je sais. En moyenne, la facture d'un psychiatre à l'assurance est 2 fois plus élevée que celle d'un traitement médical normal.
Et ça fait que j'ai plus à payer pour mon assurance.
Oui, et ça gaspille l'argent de la sécurité sociale. Au Texas, la caisse d'assurance maladie pour la santé mentale a presque été mise en faillite par une classe de psychotropes très coûteux, normalement prescrits pour le trouble bipolaire.
Mince, ça fait beaucoup de drogue.
C'est sûr. Et en plus, les diagnostics du DSM sont tellement arbitraires que le problème des fraudes aux assurances est énorme et coûte très cher. Des hôpitaux psychiatriques privés se faisaient passer pour des cliniques pour perdre du poids ou arrêter de fumer afin de faire entrer les gens à l'hôpital.
Come with me.
Ils payaient des recruteurs jusqu'à 3 000 $ pour chaque nouveau patient couvert par une assurance gouvernementale.
How many more you got coming? A bunch.
Et ils détenaient les patients aussi longtemps que possible, jusqu'à ce que l'assurance cesse de couvrir.
Et tout ça pour l'argent de l'assurance.
En effet. Et une fois que les patients sont inscrits, n'importe quel diagnostic du DSM peut justifier un traitement. Regarde cette caméra cachée où quelqu'un se fait passer pour un employé d'un hôpital psychiatrique.
I'll say patient display. That's how my opening is always a classic. Patient display. He's sort of, what do you think? You think he's,
I thought, I've interacted with him a lot, and I thought he's always appropriate. He's always...
But under behavior, what's some good words in here? He's not negative. He's sort of intrusive a little bit.
Not really.
He doesn't push limits anymore.
He's really actually intrusive.
He acts sort of anxious. Focus on the negative.
And why should we focus on negative?
Because that's how they get paid. I mean, this is what they told me. I mean, you write what you want to write. I know I got to write for you. So I know what I have to write. You know what I mean? So that's why
Like, why do you have to write it?
So this place can get paid.
Oh, okay.
It's a business thing. It's not like I'm lying, but I always like pull the negative out. Like,
you're supposed to. They tell you to.
What? The negative?
Pull the negative out.
You pull it out of it.
Ça ne peut pas être honnête.
Ça ne l'est pas. Et ce n'est qu'une partie de la fraude. Il a été découvert que les factures pour soins psychiatriques étaient en fait pour faire écouter de la musique, regarder la télé ou jouer au loto. Pour un service de réveil téléphonique, des tickets de théâtre ou des voyages outre-mer. Ou pour soi-disant traiter des gens alors qu'ils étaient en prison, dans le coma ou même morts.
Non.
Certains psychiatres avaient des rapports sexuels avec leurs patients et facturaient cela en tant que thérapie.
C'est répugnant.
Comme l'a dit un directeur des inspections d'assurance, l'ampleur de la fraude n'est limitée que par l'imagination.
J'avais aucune idée.
Peu de gens en sont conscients. La fraude dans le domaine de la santé mentale coûte 5 milliards de dollars par an aux assureurs et aux contribuables, rien qu'aux USA.
On devrait arrêter ces criminels et jeter la clé.
It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the third edition.
Est-ce que je t'ai dit que la psychiatrie a aussi réussi, grâce au DSM, à s'infiltrer dans notre système judiciaire?
La justice aussi?
Ouais.
The clinical diagnosis of a DSM-IV mental disorder is not sufficient to establish the existence for legal purposes of a mental disorder. That's a very interesting point. Basically, what the authors are saying here is that the material in the DSM has no utility in the courtroom in deciding guilt or innocence. It should not be used in courtrooms as part of the legal process.
Attends, le DSM dit qu'on ne peut pas l'utiliser dans un tribunal pour établir l'existence d'un trouble mental?
Exactement. Mais on s'en sert tout le temps.
Oui, comme pour plaider l'irresponsabilité.
Et aussi le droit de garde, détention civile, tribunal des successions.
J'ai entendu parler de psychiatres s'affrontant au tribunal, chacun utilisant le DSM pour soutenir sa partie et chacun étant accepté en tant qu'expert.
As far as I could see, for psychosis or delusions. Because he's suffering from narcissistic personality disorder and a delusional disorder.
C'est une contradiction totale. Ça n'a pas toujours été comme ça.
In the beginning of the 20th century, a psychiatrist in a courtroom would be laughed out of the courtroom by and large. Today, it's commonly accepted testimony as long as it's in accord with the DSM.
The danger in using the DSM in a court setting is that you're using a vocabulary that the judge or the jury doesn't fully understand. They are, by concocting these psychobabble words, it makes it seem like there's something there that may not be there.
The courts have allowed all this junk science to come into the courts, and they've made case law on it. And once the case law is made, we're stuck with it until it gets overridden.
They come in with tests, they come in with their diagnostic categories from the DSM, and they say, we've done tests, we've determined that this person has this numbered malady, and therefore they do. And there's almost no way to pry a judge out of accepting that.
When a psychiatrist makes a diagnosis in court, is that the person is sent to a mental institution, deprived of liberty, and we have no idea whether he's guilty or not.
Au nom des diagnostiques du DSM, une personne est internée sans consentement dans une institution psychiatrique toutes les 40 secondes.
C'est tellement injuste.
Et n'importe qui, n'importe quand, peut tout perdre à cause de l'opinion d'un psychiatre. Écoute ça.
I went to a stop smoking course at Vanderbilt. And the doctor, the lady that ran the program said that she goes, we need to get you on a stop smoking medication. So she prescribed me Zyban. Well, after the fact, I find out that Zyban is nothing but this really powerful antidepressant called Wellbutrin. Yeah, I stopped smoking, but I had no idea the hell. I mean, the hell. The hell's gates were being opened when I started taking Zyban. I had been clean and sober for 18 years. Just never considered that. But something about that, I started experiencing the craving to drink again, and my life fell apart. Divorce, relapse. So then a sibling of mine got wind of my relapse, wanted to gain control of my pocketbook and my life, and found the dirtiest lawyer in town who knew, one of the dirty psychiatrists, and bought and paid for an evaluation, had a hearing in a court before I was ever served notice. And the next thing I know, every right that a human being can possibly have was taken from me. And you have less rights as a conserved person than you do as a criminal. I mean, you are stripped of every right. You can't enter into a contract. You cannot marry. You cannot sue. You cannot even fight the legal system that has involuntarily put you in this. And it was all based on the psychiatrist's diagnosis, who never evaluated me.
C'est incroyable. Il voulait simplement arrêter de fumer, mais il a reçu le diagnostic d'un psychiatre et a été privé de tous ses droits.
Et son argent a disparu, sans parler de l'internement dans un hôpital psychiatrique. Mais si tu crois que ce que les psychiatres font à l'individu dans les tribunaux est mal, attends de voir ce qu'ils font aux familles.
Children are taken away from parents every day in these juvenile courts because a person with a PhD or an MD after their name comes in and says, I've shown ink blots to a person, and they may be a risk to a child. Just in my little state of Massachusetts here, there are 11,000 children in captivity taken away from families at any one moment. And almost all of those children are being drugged. And our own commissioner of children and families testified under oath that they drug 88% of the children that they take out of the families.
88%, c'est presque tous.
Et c'est juste la surface du problème. Dans le monde entier, les psychiatres se servent des tribunaux de diverses manières pour priver les gens de leurs droits et pour détruire les familles. Regarde.
Psychiatry has affected my family through the family law court rulings. The family law court has a court-appointed child psychiatrist who, it appears, determines the future of the child.
It's just like a business in the court system that they forced you to undergo all of these psychological evaluations, and you have to pay thousands of dollars, but at the end of the day, it has been supported by no evidence, nothing.
They'd said to me, Deb, you have a choice. Either you bring your son to get medicated, or we'll take your child away from you and put him in a home that they'll medicate your child. And then good luck. Basically, they were saying, good luck, Deb, to try and get your son back, but you'll get him back medicated anyways.
And they put her in hospital, and that's when the psychotropic drugging started with Becky. And at that stage, I had no say over it.
They refused to let her go. They would not let my daughter go unless she take medication.
This was again a recommendation from the psychiatrist that once my son was radically ripped from his home and literally kidnapped and put in a new home with a perpetrator of domestic violence and of sexual assault, and is where he now lives, this psychiatrist said that he was never to have any counselling and never to see anybody.
To have your family just disrupted like that, ripped out from under you, really, your whole life, just gone like that. And then you have to fight every day to get him back. It was very devastating.
In some ways, it's worse than a death because it's unresolved and you know what the truth is. And you feel like giving up and not fighting back for that custody of that child, but you can't. Yeah, there's just no justice.
C'est terrible. Ils détruisent les familles avec les diagnostics arbitraires qui abondent dans les tribunaux.
Exactement.
So it's unfortunate that the courts have bought into the DSM. It's unfortunate that the whole psychiatric profession is wedded to the DSM. It's unfortunate that the psychiatric profession is in bed with the drug industry, and it's unfortunate that drugs that don't work are the common prescribed drugs for all manner of conditions in children and in adults. It's the wrong way to go.
Oh non, pas eux aussi.
Malheureusement, si. Les enfants représentent un marché énorme pour la psychiatrie. Le nombre de troubles de l'enfance dans le DSM est monté en flèche, passant de 3 troubles en 1952 à 44 aujourd'hui.
C'est 15 fois plus.
Et pourtant, le DSM admet qu'il ne devrait pas faire le diagnostic d'enfant.
In early childhood, it may be difficult to distinguish symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder from age-appropriate behaviors in active children, such as running around or being noisy. We basically don't know the diagnosis from normal childhood. That's what that's saying.
Le trouble de déficit de l'attention hyperactivité, c'est le terme psychiatrique pour les gosses qui ne restent pas assis en classe, gigotent, courent, grimpent. Le comportement d'enfant typique, c'est ça?
Exactement. Et 20 millions de gosses dans le monde ont été étiquetés avec un trouble mental.
Donc, au lieu de laisser les gosses être des gosses,
les psychiatres disent aux parents que leurs enfants sont des malades mentaux qui ont besoin de psychotropes.
It used to be that you were on the playground, you had the weird kid, you had the shy kid, you had the goof off, you had the hyper kid. You can't have that anymore. Now it's all medical diagnoses.
For them to come up with new diseases and new issues and diagnosis in their book, it doesn't correct bad behavior, okay? They can give children all the pills they want. It still doesn't correct bad behavior.
The thinking still is, you must fit into this mold. And if you don't fit into this mold, there's something wrong with you. And if you're not the person who designs the mold, too bad for you.
A child is labeled and then they're brought to professionals who are trained a very particular way. They're all being trained that if the child fits into this category, then we should consider putting them on Ritalin because that's what they do. That is the protocol.
The way the Ritalin will be marketed to the parents is that they will say, this is a drug to calm your child down. What they won't say is that methylphenidate is a form of speed. It's a form of amphetamine, and what we're actually doing is overdosing your child on speed.
It's a stimulant. So naturally it's going to increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, and you put a kid out on a football field on a hot summer day, and his risk of having a cardiac event of some sort has just gone up.
J'ai entendu dire que les stimulants donnés aux gosses avec des problèmes d'attention sont chimiquement très similaires à la cocaïne.
Oui, et le risque d'abus est tellement élevé que le gouvernement américain les place dans la même catégorie que la morphine, l'opium et la méthamphétamine.
Alors ces psychiatres, qui est-ce qu'ils vont droguer après ça? Les bébés?
Exactement. Ils se servent de ce qu'ils appellent classification de diagnostic 0 à 3 ou DC 0 à 3. C'est comme un mini DSM pour les bébés et les petits-enfants. Écoute ça.
We already targeted our school children with ADHD and bipolar. That's already done. That was done 20 years ago. And we're moving younger with DC-03 to the 0 to 3 age group where they're trying to make popular the idea that it's okay to medicate 0 to 3-year-olds.
The idea of a program to determine whether a child from birth to the age of 3 has a mental illness is so preposterous, so absolutely insane, that it's simply an additional part of the insanity that is now extant throughout this country. I cannot think of a program that is more insane than that.
How are they going to diagnose a 1-year-old or an infant with a psychological disorder? How do they know?
You almost have to ask ourselves, if our societies become sick, what are we doing to our fetuses, our infants, our children, that would make us need to have psychiatric medications?
We're rolling dice with life. We're rolling dice with our children who can't even discuss it with anybody. They have no control. They are the helpless victims, and the ones who are supposed to protect them and care aren't armed with the facts.
Si les parents savaient ça, ils seraient furieux.
Ça, c'est vrai. Mais attention, parce que le DSM dit aussi que vous pouvez attraper une maladie mentale de vos enfants.
Tu plaisantes.
C'est dans le DSM.
We're going to talk about some of the proposed changes that are suggested for DSM-V.
J'ai entendu dire que le DSM-V est encore plus dingue que le DSM-IV.
C'est bien vrai.
You've got 374 named diagnoses in DSM. Well, guess what? There's going to be more in DSM-V.
Why do we all of a sudden need a fifth DSM-V? Psychiatry wanted to broaden the horizons of mental health problems, of disorders. They wanted to stretch the disorders so it would encompass more. And to do that, you know, they're going to add more diagnoses.
We need more diagnoses like we need a hole in the head, really. They're not serving a purpose for mankind, all these diagnoses. They're almost laughable, some of the diagnoses.
Ridicule? Vraiment?
Bon, il parle d'un trouble d'amassement si on ne se débarrasse pas d'assez de choses.
Persistent difficulty discarding or parting with personal possessions.
Le trouble d'excès alimentaire, c'est trop manger trop souvent.
Recurrent episodes of binge eating.
Oh, et il y a un trouble pour les personnes qui se grattent.
So it's recurrent skin picking resulting in skin lesions.
Ce sont des troubles mentaux?
Et il existe aussi un nouveau trouble qui englobera tous les enfants dont les crises de colère sont encore insuffisantes pour l'étiquette bipolaire.
They've created temperate dysregulation disorder to seem a little bit more mild of the condition and include a lot of the younger population in terms of that diagnosis. And what it essentially does, it just broadens bipolar disorder into a whole other new category. And where they don't fit into bipolar, now they can fit into this other diagnosing criteria.
Le filet devient de plus en plus vaste.
Encore plus que tu ne le penses. Ils envisagent même d'ajouter une étiquette pour ceux qui passent trop de temps à l'ordinateur.
Internet addiction diagnosis. You know, it's another example of, just taking something going on in the popular culture that's, pretty widespread and then finding a way to pathologize it.
I know people personally that spend 12, 13, 14 hours a day on the internet or social networking groups like Facebook. So there is something going on there. But is it a condition that we need to then label and drug? Absolutely not.
C'est ridicule.
Oui, mais sache qu'en Chine, le gouvernement a déjà établi des cliniques psychiatriques qui traitent les adolescents pour, je cite, « utilisation problématique de l'ordinateur ». Et ils ont parfois recours à des électrochocs pour les soigner.
Non.
Et si tu trouves ça révoltant, il y a encore une addition pour le prochain DSM qui fait vraiment froid dans le dos.
Sans blague.
Avec ce diagnostic, il pousse encore plus loin. Il s'agit du syndrome de risque de psychose, appelé plus récemment syndrome de symptômes psychotiques atténués.
C'est un nom à coucher dehors. Mais qu'est-ce qu'il veut dire?
A really scary thing that's coming on the horizon is to come up with a whole bunch of diagnoses in there that are looking at people who currently are mentally well-adjusted but have a risk of developing a mental illness in the future.
They're still thinking they can define well before the symptoms develop the risk of a person developing a major mental disorder without any biochemical, biological or genetic test or any physical test whatsoever.
They don't know the cause of a mental illness. They can't treat it, they can't cure it. So how can they launch a preventative campaign for mental illness? It just logically, it falters.
Attends un peu. Les psychiatres pensent-ils vraiment pouvoir prédire un trouble futur?
Eh bien, écoutons-les.
How can psychiatrists know if you're going to have a mental disorder in the future?
Again, that we don't know categorically who will develop psychiatric illness in the future.
It's really hard to say, actually. I don't know if you could 100% predict for anybody.
You can't forecast if one will develop a psychiatric disorder.
Maybe not, or maybe yes.
It's hard to predict.
It's hard to predict.
There's no way to predict that.
Well, I don't think that nobody knows that.
There's no way to tell.
Nobody knows?
I don't think anyone can know what's going to happen in the future.
Ils n'ont pas la moindre idée.
C'est ça. Pourtant, ils proposent déjà de tester les enfants pour dépister des maladies mentales futures.
Pour pouvoir les traiter maintenant.
Bien sûr.
I would hate to see us go into the type of society where people are
locked up for what they may do in the future rather than what they actually have done.
Identifying people who are pre-psychotic would be a huge industry.
Ah, c'est vraiment terrifiant.
Ce qui n'a pas de sens, c'est que les psychiatres continuent de travailler sur le DSM-V, bien que certains des plus influents admettent qu'il ne vaut rien.
Any comment on DSM-V? It's of no use to us in the rest of the world. You know?
Même le psychiatre à la tête de l'Institut national de la santé mentale est réservé à son sujet.
I don't do DSM. I'm not involved. So, and that maybe tells you more than anything. NIMH is not involved with DSM.
Donc, la tête de la plus grande agence psychiatrique gouvernementale du monde ne veut rien avoir à faire avec le DSM.
Cela semble être le cas. Il s'agit bien d'une imposture.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is effectively the story that is being wrapped up in statistics and numbers and categories that when medicine tosses, doesn't fit any of our categories over to psychiatry, psychiatry says we'll find a category, and if we don't, DSM-V or 6 or 7 will.
I think in 2016 we'll be looking at DSM-6 and there will be 1,425 diagnoses and I'll have 900 of them.
Mais c'est de la folie.
Tout à fait. Mais c'est conçu pour englober de plus en plus de gens sous l'égide des diagnostics psychiatriques.
De façon à tirer profit d'encore plus de comportements normaux.
Exactement.
Bon, si le DSM ne vaut rien, pourquoi les psychiatres? Oh, je sais, c'est une question d'argent, non?
Avec la psychiatrie, c'est toujours une question d'argent. Et ça commence par le DSM. Comme l'a dit Robert Spitzer,
the American Psychiatric Association found out it could make a lot of money by selling it. They've made a tremendous amount of money.
Every time they revise the DSM system, the American Psychiatric Association makes a hell of a lot of money.
Un fric fou? De combien on parle?
6,5 millions de dollars en vente par an.
Ouh.
Mais ce n'est pas juste les ventes du DSM qui rapportent gros. Les psychiatres et les laboratoires gagnent de l'argent chaque fois qu'ils s'en servent pour un diagnostic.
You create disorders so that you can treat it with a drug. It's the ultimate money-making machine.
How many people can we drug? How many labels can we put out there? How many people can we herd into these labels and feed them a drug so we can get richer, make more money?
There's an inherent conflict of interest, and that conflict of interest is driven by the desire to make money. More money, more money, more money than one should expect.
Huge money in the psychopharm business. If you really did the research on these diagnoses, see that 90% of them or more don't exist, they're not valid, then that's all of a sudden, all that reimbursement from the insurance companies disappears.
So we have to cut the money cord, as well as cutting the DSM cord if we're ever going to really succeed, stopping this juggernaut from continuing.
And once again, it's follow the money, and you'll get your answer every time.
Cela m'a vraiment ouvert les yeux. Voyons, il n'y a pas de test de labo pour un soi-disant trouble mental que le psychiatre ne peut même pas décrire dans son propre manuel. La théorie du déséquilibre chimique est fallacieuse et pourtant les psychotropes sous prétexte d'équilibrer la chimie du cerveau sont prescrits à des personnes de tous âges.
Absolument. Pour 84 milliards de dollars par an, ce qui rajoute 10 milliards de dollars au montant à payer aux assurances sociales ou privées, rien qu'aux États-Unis.
Et nous payons pour tout cela sous forme de cotisation ou de facture d'assurance.
En effet, l'industrie psychiatrique se sert du DSM pour récolter 330 milliards de dollars par an.
C'est presque un tiers d'1 billion de dollars.
Et ça augmente, c'est fou.
Well, the whole system is now a runaway train, but the DSM is the locomotive. And if you took the locomotive off, eventually the train would stop, because there'd be nothing more pulling it.
We're losing the concept of health. Everybody is sick and everybody's got a condition and everybody needs drugs.
You're going to end up with a whole society that's going to basically have to be led around by the hand. But who's going to lead them around? Because they're drugging so many of them.
In psychiatry, you know in your heart of hearts that you're not really diagnosing. You know in your heart of hearts that you can't really treat what you think might be wrong. And you also know that most of what you're dealing with in the DSM is unprovable and unreliable, not a predictable indicator. So what do you have then?
Bonne question. Il semblerait qu'ils n'ont rien.
Mais ils font du mal aux gens.
Ouais.
You're very lucky to go through psychiatry and survive. It really is as simple as that.
Only when enough people rip the veneer away and show that it's just nothing more than a Hollywood set is it ever going to fall down.
It would be good if all the medical professionals who are really practicing medicine and really trying to help people and based on scientific fact and what they can best do to improve the lives of others, if they would recognize, just be able to look at this fact. It's hard to look at it, but look at this fact and be ethical and be honest and clean up the profession by getting rid of this fraudulent part of it. Psychiatry.
Je n'aurais pas pu le dire mieux. C'est tellement évident. Il faut qu'on se débarrasse du DSM. C'est terrible pour la société.
Je sais. Malgré sa précarité extrême, le manuel diagnostique et statistique a littéralement impacté chaque partie de notre monde.
Nos écoles, nos gouvernements...
Nos systèmes judiciaires...
Et les médias et l'armée.
Pareil.
En fait, la société tout entière.
Et tout cela sans que personne ne soit guéri.
Le DSM n'est pas seulement un château de cartes.
Le manuel diagnostique et statistique est le coup de poker le plus funeste de la psychiatrie.